Hi, right, so after the fighting comes the talking. And hopefully after the fighting came the new introduction over or embedded in the video rather than diegetic sound. Don't bother writing in to tell me, I'll work it out for myself. But do please write in to tell me how you find the videos. Every now and again I get a lovely comment on the comment pages saying that they found them useful, and that's great. That makes it all worthwhile. So do please let me know, and let me know as well if you think there's something I should be doing better, and I'll see what I can do. If there's a subject that I haven't covered, I'll try to work that into the equation. Right, that's enough talking from me. Let's get on to talking in the context of the American Constitution and specifically what it means for the presidential power. So we're going to start with de jure. And this means that the president is chief diplomat. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, that means that the president is in charge of the diplomatic corps. Now, he doesn't, he kind of appoints them, but what he does is he nominates them and then they're ratified by the Senate. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. But everyone from the Secretary of State, which rather confusingly is their version of the foreign secretary, through to the ambassador to the court of St. James, which also confusingly is what they call the ambassador to the UK, through to the ambassador for Zimbabwe and Zaire and Vanuatu, all of those guys at the other end of the alphabet. By the way, nothing wrong with Vanuatu or Zimbabwe or Zaire. I'd love to go and visit. Do please, if there's anybody there listening to this, send me an invitation. So, okay, so he appoints the rest of the diplomatic corps and he controls diplomatic policy. So he's in charge of negotiations and not just negotiations, but also managing embassies. Now, this might seem a bit niche, but actually it's a really easy win for your essays because within that we've got these really interesting little exchanges there. Now, I never got massively excited about managing embassies, but Cuba there, Obama opened his in 2015, which created quite a big thing. And then Trump closed it in 2018 because Trump doesn't like things that Obama did, particularly if they're progressive. And so he shut it down. At the same time, he unilaterally moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the key point here is there's nothing really that Congress can do about it specifically. Congress can make a fuss and it can threaten to withhold the general budget. But as all of this is paid out of the overall diplomatic corps, diplomatic budget, it's hard for Congress to do anything specifically about these things. So here, Trump can, or the president can, pretty much move unilaterally. So what can they do? Well, the Senate has their role of advice and consent. So they ratify appointments, ratifies treaties, which would be useful if they were making treaties. I'm going to hold that thought for a second. Because no one makes treaties anymore. Because they're so complicated and because the Senate may or may not choose to ratify them, presidents nowadays seem to be going down the executive agreement route. So Obama negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with various parties in Iran, while he also negotiated the Paris Climate Accord. Neither of those required Senate ratification because they were not actual treaties. They were agreements between Obama and those particular parties, and as such, they're weaker than treaties because they're not binding. They can expire with the executive that negotiated them. If the incoming president wishes to continue with them, then he can do. But obviously, Obama was interested in neither of those. And so he declared that he was not going to continue with them, and they both died. Well, they both neither. The US is not a signatory to neither of those. Trump also has a series of bilateral agreements with Kim Jong-un and North Korea for whatever they're worth, which appears to be not very much. So there we have some examples of executive agreements, and I think what's really good there is that the weakness of those agreements with North Korea demonstrates the systemic problems that are attached to executive agreements, that they're worth barely the paper they're written on. It's more to do with the intent behind them. And in terms of North Korea, there was very little intent on either party really to do much about them. Whereas in the case of Obama, there was a genuine commitment to try to make Iran better, or try to solve make the Iranian situation better, and certainly to involve the United States in those climate agreements. It's not entirely clear where exags sit relative to congressional sanction, other than general use of power of the purse. And this is much more important, really. Congress controls trade and aid through the medium of law, through the mechanism of law, specifically through the Commerce Clause. We also often think of this Commerce Clause as being the interstate Commerce Clause, but it also gives Congress the right to regulate commerce with foreign nations, with a capital N, because the Founding Fathers were pretty lousy with their spag. The thing is that having been given the ability to negotiate trade with foreign nations, Congress keeps giving it away. And we have all of these different laws that have essentially shunted the initiative and the main responsibility for negotiating treaties onto the president. Negotiating trade agreements onto the president. Now, the constitutional position of these is fairly dubious, but no one sought to challenge them, or certainly not to challenge them successfully. And so what we see is the president largely dictating trade policy, which is bizarre. That's not really what the Constitution wanted at all. But the president is able to take the initiative in these things. So we've seen a shift in power from Congress to the executive in terms of trade negotiations, particularly evident with Trump starting his trade wars with China and the way in which we've desperately been trying to negotiate trade agreements with, in the post-Brexit environment, we're hanging on Trump's every word in terms of whether or not he's going to extend a trade agreement with the UK. So yeah, complicated stuff by all means. Let's have a look at some case studies. The League of Nations, go back to your Year 8 history, and you'll probably remember that the Senate refused to sign it, even though it was negotiated by the President. And so the United States was not a signatory to the League of Nations. Kyoto, a climate agreement in 1998, negotiated by Clinton. The Senate refused to sign that. Nuclear weapons, we've got a few treaties there. 2010, this was the New START, the Strategic Arms Reductions Talk, negotiated by Obama and signed off by the Senate. And in Iran, again, we had that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiations conditional, blah, 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 blah. So it was all kind of complicated, but it was working. It was actually working. Congress was withholding on the new sanctions. They were waiting to see what was happening with the new president. Obama went down the executive agreement route, so that was agreed between him and various parties in Iran and in other countries. And of course, Trump sought to extricate the United States from it. In terms of IS, we see Obama definitely trying to negotiate with IS, not really succeeding, the same way that he tried to negotiate with Assad and didn't particularly succeed there. So the Constitution doesn't really help much when it comes to trade, when it comes to negotiations. It's been overtaken by technology and the needs of the day. It just seems easier for the president to undertake all of this, and having invested all of that time and energy in these negotiations, he does not really want Congress to turn around and say, well, we're not going to sign it. Congress does have the means to check the president. They could be more awkward. They could be enforcing their role in trade negotiations and in aid negotiations. But they just seem happier for the president to take the lead on this. And we find ourselves now in this position where while the if we're looking at foreign policy, we don't negotiate treaties anymore. They're all executive agreements. Congress is supposed to control trade and aid, but they seem to have ceded that to the president. So here we're definitely seeing an expansion of the presidential role in foreign policy that was perhaps not anticipated by the founding fathers. Yes, they would anticipate that the executive would be the lead person in any negotiations, in any foreign negotiations. But he was still supposed to be subject to congressional control. And that just doesn't seem to be happening anymore for whatever reason. And you can see that with Bush and his actions in the Middle East. You can see that with Obama and his ability to ignore the Senate in terms of their concerns over the Iranian deal. And certainly in terms of Trump, that's his name, who conducts foreign policy by tweet, giving succor to enemies such as the Russians and indeed North Korea, while managing to annoy almost all of their real ally, well, the regular allies in the shape of the EU and various other parties. Let's have a look at Trump. So North Korea, we have these bilateral agreements that really didn't change very much. In terms of Iran, he opposed the 2014 deal, arguing that he could do a much better one. That hasn't happened yet. And in terms of Russia, this bizarre situation where Trump rejected the conclusions of the CIA and the FBI, choosing to believe Putin, who said, well, you can read it there for yourself. In terms of Ukraine, we have, again, that unilateral withholding of military aid, allegedly, in a quid pro quo for pressure on political rivals. This is where you wind up if Congress doesn't do its job. If Congress is not prepared to check the president in these foreign arenas, then you get all of these bizarre deals being taken on unilaterally by Trump. So, here we see real presidential expansion and a distinct unwillingness of Congress to step in and do what's required. So there we go. That's that. Some scary stuff there. But let me know what you think. Let me know your questions. And I will happily answer them as best as I possibly can. Cue the music, and I'm out of here. Thank you very much, and bye for now.